From Eddie Bravo seriously arguing about nuclear bombs being fake, to Brian Dunning accusing Rogan of promoting dangerous beliefs, here are the most awkward moments on the Joe Rogan Experience. Diving right into one of the wackiest conspiracy theories. There was a time when Bravo completely denied nuclear bombs are a thing. Now we know Joe Rogan and Eddie have been good friends since, like, forever. They're both super into martial arts and all that jazz, but they also share this weird obsession with conspiracy theories. While Joe has kind of mellowed out on the whole conspiracy thing over the years, though, Eddie has gone full steam ahead with his crazy beliefs. The dude legit thinks the Earth is flat and doesn't shy away from sharing his thoughts on it. Don't get me wrong. Usually, Eddie's wacky ideas make for some hilarious discussions on the show. But the thing is, he's so incredibly sure about his views that it leaves no room for disagreement, which, as you can imagine, can irritate a lot of people, including Rogan himself. So, in one episode in 2018, the two guys were talking about nuclear bombs, and Eddie drops this bombshell, pun intended, that he's not fully convinced they even exist. You could see how hostile the situation was getting because Joe called him out for being insane. Hell, even young Jamie, who's the producer and all-around tech guy on the show, couldn't hold it in anymore, and he jumped in to openly disagree with Eddie. It was like talking to a brick wall, though, because Bravo wasn't ready to budge from his point of view. And then young Jamie made things a teensy bit more awkward when he tried to prove his point by bragging about getting an A in his physics class back in college. Yeah, I don't think it works like that, buddy. But hey, at least they had some ample information to debate over. Can't say the same for when Kiara Lynch entered the room in one of the episodes. I'm sure you all know how much Rogan likes to talk, right? So when he purposely ends an episode early, it's pretty clear things must have been super weird, to the point that Joe himself couldn't carry the conversation anymore. Well, that's exactly what happened when Rogan decided to switch things up a bit for once, and instead of calling his usual comedian and fighters on the show, he sent an invite to Kiara Lynch, who's an internet humiliatrix of sorts and living quite an unusual life. But even her interesting lifestyle couldn't provide some fun topics to talk about, because the conversations between her and Joe seemed so awkward that it was genuinely painful to watch. I'm not saying Kiara didn't have some pretty interesting insights into her bizarre profession, but the two just didn't click. At one point, even Rogan realized he couldn't say much anymore. So the episode got wrapped in less than an hour, which is insanely short for the JRE. Many fans later commented that episode could have used some of the old crew, especially Brian Redband, who used to be the producer. He had this crude sense of humor that no doubt would have meshed well with Kiara's weird sexual stories. But sometimes, even when you have a million things in common to talk about, things can go down fast with just one bad comment. Take Jamie Kilstein time on the podcast, for example. As a fellow Brazilian jiu-jitsu enthusiast and comedian, you'd think Rogan would have no trouble having a great conversation with Jamie, who shares similar interests and hobbies. And to be fair, when Jamie came on the show for the second time in 2012, things were going smoothly for the first 90 minutes of the podcast. But then, during that time, there was this whole controversy around Daniel Tosh, the former host of Tosh.0, making a joke about sexual violence in response to a heckler. And guess what? That topic comes up in the episode. As soon as Joe and Jamie start discussing Daniel's comment, though, and the broader culture surrounding sexual violence, things go downhill fast when they don't find much common ground. The episode turns into a train wreck of awkwardness, and Rogan is probably the most frustrated he's ever been on the podcast. To make matters even weirder, Kilstein later left the progressive podcast Citizen Radio in 2017 because of accusations of predatory and emotionally abusive behavior towards some of his female co-workers. Oh, it's like this guy left no room for redemption after making some problematic comments on the podcast. Not every podcast had ended this badly, though, even if they did start out with an intensely heated debate, like the time Steven Crowder wasn't sold on weed having medicinal properties. This happened in episode 917, and it's one of those debates that fans of the podcast will never forget because of how quickly tense the whole thing got in the room that day. The drama starts when Joe asks Crowder about the topics he doesn't want to discuss, and when Crowder mentions the issue of marijuana, Rogan instantly gets confrontational, and the conversation quickly takes a sharp turn for the worse. To Crowder's credit, he does try to change the subject, but his comments clearly hit a nerve with Joe, who looks slightly intoxicated. You best believe Rogan is hell-bent on defending the medicinal properties of weed, which he holds dear to his heart. What makes the whole thing so weird is that there seems to be a difference in how the two are taking in the hostile conversation. Rogan seemed to love throwing jabs, but in a friendly, I'm just messing with you kind of way. Crowder, on the other hand, clearly isn't enjoying it. Thankfully, Joe apologized for his actions later on in a lengthy Instagram post showing that he recognized where he'd gone wrong. And hey, Crowder actually appeared on the show again in 2018 without any controversies, so at least things worked out in the end. But I'll tell you what's something I never want to see again on the show. The time when Brian Redban and Bill Burr argued about Stitcher without actually understanding what the other person was saying. Now, we all know young Jamie has always been there behind the desk pulling up stuff on the show, right? Well, before him, there was this comedian named Brian Redban, who was the producer. To say this guy brought a whole lot of chaos to the show would be a huge understatement. I mean, take a look at episode 91 of the JRE, because this was when Redban managed to stir up some trouble with none other than the American comic Bill Burr. It all started when the podcast was winding down, and Burr shared that he had to ask the podcast service, Stitcher, to remove his show from their platform because they used it without his permission. Instead of empathizing, Brian started to declare his undying support for the service. To make matters worse, Brian refuses to listen to Burr's side of the story, which led to a back and forth that went on for more than half an hour. Hell, by the end of the episode, it's so cringy, because Redban just can't seem to grasp what Burr is trying to say, and it turns into this bizarre exchange that leaves everyone scratching their heads. I'd say this was still a mellow conversation when you compare it to how angry Rogan got when he invited Brian Dunning to his show. Some fans say Joe intentionally called the guy to feature on the podcast back in 2014 so that he could pick a fight with him. This means that things were bound to be a little rocky because of the things that had happened before he appeared on the show. Turns out Dunning wrote an article accusing Rogan of promoting harmful beliefs and practices because he had previously talked about his doubts when it came to the official version of events surrounding 9/11. You can imagine that Joe didn't take that article well, especially since it was portraying him in such a negative light. So as soon as Brian got comfortable at the show, Rogan called him out on his comments and even played a video of the Twin Towers asking how it's controversial to suggest it looks like a controlled demolition. On top of that, Joe accused him of spreading misinformation because many things he said Joe believed in were actually false. Even Redban jumped in and broke down some of Dunning's statements during the episode. On the other hand, Brian didn't back down either and doubled down on his claims. Woo, things got pretty serious by the end, and it was clear the situation had ended on a bad note. Also, unlike some other heated moments on the JRE, it doesn't seem like Joe and Dunning resolved their differences later on. To be fair, it's understandable considering how aggressively the guy was arguing during his time there. So there you have it. From Brian Dunning accusing Rogan of promoting dangerous beliefs, to Eddie Bravo seriously arguing about nuclear bombs being fake, these were the most awkward moments on the Joe Rogan Experience.